anytime a company raises $100 million, they have to have pretty serious plans about what to do that. And Wildtype does. And so I caught up with their CEO, Justin Kolbeck, who we spoke to before at the Smart Kitchen Summit. I had him on a Clubhouse last year to talk about the future of seafood. And Justin and I talk about what they plan on doing with their $100 million Series B round, the biggest ever for a cell-cultured seafood company. We talk about their expansion of their production capacity in San Francisco. We talk about their plans to bring cell-cultured meat production up to the Pacific Northwest, where I live. I'm excited about that. Hopefully I'll get to try it out when they come up here at some point. And where they are with the FDA in terms of the approval process for serving cell-cultivated seafood to consumers. So it was a good conversation. I hope you enjoyed. You can find out more about them at wildtypefoods.com. You can read about my conversation with Justin at The Spoon. You can also find links to the announcement there. So, all right, folks, that's it. Let's get to it. Hey, well, I'm really excited to be here with Justin Kolbeck, the CEO and co-founder of Wildtype. Hey, Justin, how are you doing?
Hey, Mike. Great to connect again.
Yeah, it's been a while since we caught up. I think last year we did a Clubhouse on the future of fish, but now we're getting together because you guys have some pretty big news. You are announcing your Series B $100 million.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's a nice chunk of money.
Yeah.
That's a lot of zeros. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so I thought it'd be a good occasion to kind of catch up because you guys specify kind of the things you want to do with that and talk about the future of fish. But before we get to that, for people who don't know about Wildtype, very briefly, you guys are creating cell-cultivated fish, salmon in particular, but maybe you could do a better job explaining how do you kind of pitch the idea of Wildtype to someone who doesn't know anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, I can start by giving you like the reason that we exist. I think that's probably helpful. And I was actually just looking at some data that I was seeing for the first time this morning. So it's fresh in my mind. So there's this annual, maybe I think it's every 5 years that FAO puts out this state of the fisheries report. And I was looking at a couple charts. One of them shows what percentage of fish that are currently being fished are sustainably fished. And that percentage, let's just say the percentage of kind of collapsed fisheries went from like 3% or so in like 1974 to something like a third of all of the fisheries today have collapsed. And what's interesting is if you then look at another chart in that same report, that's about the year that aquaculture really started coming online and becoming a big part of what we're doing. So even though aquaculture has, I think, helped blunt a lot of the impact to wild fish populations, the appetite for seafood has grown so much that we're still seeing this terrible downward trajectory in the health of our oceans. And Sylvia Earle and other people have said this much better than I ever could, but, the health of our oceans is the health of our species. We just can't exist without that. And that's why we're here. So, we are making, as you pointed out, cell-cultivated salmon, seafood more broadly, but salmon is our flagship product and the one that we're going to be launching with hopefully very soon. And really we're intended to add in a third source of supply to help, hopefully stop that line from going in the wrong direction and stabilize it and eventually, hopefully, allow wild fish populations to regenerate. And, if you listen to anything David Attenborough says, which I believe, if we can just give our fisheries a break for 5-10 years, like we can turn the ship around. If we wait another 10 or 15 years, that opportunity, may have sailed, pardon the pun. So that's why we're here. We've been around since 2016, founded, with my very good friend that I've known for a decade, Arya Elfenbein, who's a practicing cardiologist. So he's an MD and a PhD, in molecular biology and just an overall great guy. And we've been hammering away at this for the last, 5-6 years now. So, that's the not so quick introduction.
And I do want to get into where you are in terms of bringing product to market, but, I want to hear a little bit about those early days. So, Arya is a practicing cardiologist and, you guys started 2016 pretty early. I think around the same time the Blue Nalus of the world started to get going. So kind of like those early days of companies starting to think about doing cell cultivated fish. How did you come up with the idea? How did you and Aria get together for this?
So Ari and I have known each other for a decade. He spoke at my weddings, a dear friend. And he and I met actually when we were both at Yale. He was starting his residency after finishing his MD PhD, and I took a break from the Foreign Service to go and get an MBA at Yale. We met at a dinner, funny enough. Somewhat fortuitously, I would say. But, we had been talking about different ideas over the years. We'd get together at coffee shops in New York City and kind of just brain dump different potential business ideas. I think we both kind of had this entrepreneurial itch that neither of us had really had a chance to scratch. And we weren't young. I mean, we were like in our early 30s at that point. But we just hadn't done it yet. And in 2015, he came back from a conference that Mark Post had organized in the Netherlands. And it's funny, like a lot of the people now that have kind of founded companies.
The famous,
yeah. It's
Mark
this like
Post
origin event, right? Like Isha was there from New Harvest, and all these other people who have since gone on to found companies.
It's kind of a big bang for cell cultivated food.
Kinda, yeah. I think, yeah. And there's this like great story. I guess some like bird had taken a crap on Aria's shoulder at the event, and like. Like one of the, I think it was Paul Shapiro was like, hey, you gotta, I think it was Paul who got crapped on, and Aria pointed that out to Paul because he hadn't seen it. So anyway, all of these people were at this event. And Aria came back from that and he's like, Justin, this is it, cause he had been working, around that time in the lab working on cardiac regeneration therapeutics. And I actually went to go visit him one time at the Gladstone Institutes where he was researching at the time. And, he walked me into the lab and showed me on a dish these cardiomyocytes that he had grown, the grown sheets. And if you look at them under the microscope, they beat, which is just kind of incredible. Like even at the basic cellular level, the cells they already have this pacemaking ability. And, he was like, look, cells are programmed to do this, right? We're not like taking apart a corn protein and like, breaking it down to its amino acids and trying to rebuild it into something that mimics meat. Cells they are ingrained with, the direction that they need to go to create these functions in the animal. And if we could only harness that and sort of direct it toward meat and other kind of applications, the sky's really the limit. So, he kind of pitched me on it, and I have to be honest, I was really skeptical, for a couple of reasons. One, I was like, okay, cool, growing a couple beating heart cells in a dish is one thing. Making a dent in 350 billion pounds of seafood a year is something else entirely, right? Like that level of scale is just, explodes my mind, even still. So
you were skeptical, but was it that early part of the conversation when he came back to you? Was it fish? Did you guys center on that pretty quickly?
I was, at the time I was working as a consultant. So I was thinking about everything in like 2x2 matrices. And like, I was thinking about like price on one matrix and sort of like problematic production methods on another. And if you kind of map those with a focus on market size, seafood is the glaring, thing, right? So it's one of the few things that we still hunt. Which is crazy that, our species is still hunting its food. And if you look at wild fish populations, like I was talking about, they're on this terrible downward trajectory. Aquaculture is part of the solution, but it's not on its own adequate. If you look at, just to nerd out on data again, which I do often, we actually made a graph of CPI trends, over the last 50 years. And if you map salmon prices also from CPI data, you'll see them dramatically outpacing kind of overall rising costs over the last 10 years. And there's been a bunch of news lately in the kind of salmon circles about prices continuing to rise. And it started before the kind of most recent inflation crisis. And so one of the most, and Ari is a cardiologist, so we didn't want to make a sausage or another hamburger. We wanted to make something nutritious and, that has been growing really rapidly here in the US, and salmon's an obvious choice. And so very quickly, I think we honed in on seafood, and then we honed in on salmon, as an obvious place to start, just because it's such a huge part of our seafood supply.
Yeah. So you had those early conversations, 2015. You took a little bit of time to come around, but by 2016, it sounds like you have, because you guys founded the company at that point. How did those early days look like? Was it you and him in a room together?
Yeah.
When did you start to like raise funding and hire people?
Yeah, it was a year, the year of 2016. It was just the two of us. And then into 2017, it was a nights and weekends kind of moonlighting thing. I needed to get over the technical feasibility. And then how are we going to explain this to people so that they understand it, that they'll be excited to kind of buy these products? Because this is a really new way of making food. So, eventually I got to that point of conviction. And by, I think it was like October of 2017, we decided, we'd built our first prototype. I had been very convinced that this could scale. And then we started, kind of talking to investors at that point and closed our first round of financing in January of 2018. So
it's interesting that like early days, you were thinking about consumer acceptance of this very new way of eating. It seems like a lot of times when folks are kind of early days, they're just focusing on the technology. And it sounds like you thought a lot about like, hey, at some point we need to convince consumers this is salmon. This is just a new way of producing salmon. And you came to the conclusion that you could convince them of that. Has that kind of been something you have continued to think about and are working on?
Oh yeah. That I think thread flows throughout everything we do at Wildtype. Certainly as it pertains to anything outward facing, there's, if you ask the person on the street about this kind of technology, they'd have a really hard time distinguishing what we're doing from, let's say, Impossible Foods. They would sort of like lump all of that into this like lab grown category. Yeah. And, that's not helpful for a bunch of reasons, right? Our technology is meaningfully different from that. And so there's an educational component, just helping people understand like, what is this actually? And then there's getting people comfortable with it, right? So there's, as you know, there's a big move toward organic, natural, local foods, right? That's been underway for, more than a decade now. And to a certain extent, this kind of technology flies in the face of that. And so, I was really concerned that if we weren't thoughtful about the kinds of decisions we were making, and I'll give you a really clear example. So using genetic engineering, is something that we've thought about at times, right? There's absolutely no evidence that anything genetically engineered is harmful at all, yet this perception persists in the consumer's mind. And it could potentially be a very powerful tool that we can use to help make our products scale faster, lower cost in the end, and so on. But we've had to think about how we sort of juggle those sort of consumer perceptions with the tools that are available to us. And so, yeah, I think from the jump, we've been very, very focused on how do we talk about this, and how are people's thoughts evolving on it, right? And so I'll give you an example. I mean, survey after survey, it doesn't matter who does it, whether it's like the Good Food Institute or an academic or whatever. Over the last few years, it's been about 33% of people surveyed when you ask them like, hey, would you be excited or very excited to try a cell cultivated product? About 33% will say yes. And, so if you see a headline, the headline is like 66% of people are not interested in trying it. But like 33% of consumers who are, that's 100 billion pounds of seafood per year that would go to sort of satisfying these people. So that's like a very big market. But then within that group, how do we get those first early adopters, right? And in our case, those are restaurants, like those first people to want to carry these products as soon as we're done with FDA. That's been something that's been occupying, I think, a lot of our energy lately.
Very interesting. And yeah, I'm always a little bit dubious of those surveys because like, it's like surveying someone on like their favorite type of semiconductor, right? Like it's like a highly technical concept. I think most people don't understand and as you said, like a lot of people kind of glump you together with impossible. I don't think they really understand what it is, but getting back to the genetic engineering. So it sounds like you aren't doing any sort of like, you've kind of made the decision as a company not to do things like gene editing, in terms of creating your product.
To date, yeah, our products don't have that. We haven't made our products using genetic engineering.
Okay. You guys have continued to work on the product. I think last year you did build a pilot production plant. Mm-hmm. So you made a lot of progress between 2017 and then 2021. you kind of got to the point where you actually wanted to start kind of figuring out how to make the stuff. And so, talk about that building of the pilot production plan. What did you learn, and kind of what are you going to kind of build up on going forward with that?
Yeah. Thanks for asking about that. So the organizing thought there was, let's build a pilot plant on Series A money, right? And, I think we've always tried to be very, not frugal, but thoughtful about how we spend our money. So our Series A was $12.5 million. And, we made that last for a couple of years, and we built a pilot plant on it. The world's first operational cultivated seafood pilot plant. Was it intended to sort of be our go-to-market plant? No. The idea was, how could we set something up quickly and modularly that we could add capacity to and start learning from as we scaled, right? So for example, there's a pretty significant difference on even just something as simple as sterility. Like if you're working with a bioreactor that I can sit on my desk here, that's, let's say a foot or 2 feet tall, I can just throw it in this fancy oven called an autoclave. It'll kill all of the bacteria, and then pop our cells in there and off we go. It's just as easy as brewing. But when you get to bigger scales, there just aren't these kind of sterility techniques. And so you need to do things like steaming in place, right? So you sort of heat the tank up and kill all the bacteria in there. You clean it in place and so on. And, we didn't want to wait until we had built this like $50 million facility to start testing our product's ability to kind of transition into these bigger tanks. And so we custom designed our own tanks. We hired some mechanical engineers to kind of do the CAD drawings, and we built and commissioned our first bioreactors way back last summer, well before Upside opened its first, kind of pilot plant in Emeryville, or Berkeley rather. And the idea was to learn from that and to have that inform sort of subsequent facilities that we're looking at. So, and we've done that, and we've learned a heck of a lot, and we're still on that journey. And so right now we're actually, upgrading our San Francisco, facilities, kind of moving to a slightly bigger place, which I'll be able to share a little bit more on soon, hopefully. And we're actually looking for, our next large scale facility, which is, going to be in salmon country. And so that's really, if we had waited till now to start building the thing, like we wouldn't have had the data, we wouldn't have had the information, we wouldn't have had the know-how to sort of inform like what is even a sensible floor plan, right? Because we hadn't gone through the motions of, growing cells and then creating the scaffold and, seeding the cells on the scaffold and so on. And now we've done that. And I think we've learned a heck of a lot since then.
You mentioned salmon country. I think we're both like calling in today from Seattle. So are you looking at the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. We're going to have a cell cultivated, seafood production plant up here. That's awesome.
Hopefully,
I think, you're based out of Seattle, right?
Yeah. I live here and, commute down to the Bay.
So it's interesting that you, custom built your own bioreactors. I mean, one of the things I've just been looking a lot at over the past year is just like the picks and axes for cell cultivated meat production. It seems like that industry seems like it needs to be built out a little bit. There's like if we use the analogy with the internet, there's no like Cisco today building kind of big iron for like they built for the internet for cell cultivated meat production. So do you always envision a future where you'll kind of be custom designing your own hardware? Or do you think at some point you'll standardized equipment provider where you can kind of use some of their know-how and kind of expertise?
So that's a great question. So part of the reason we did that is because we didn't want to just so there are large bioreactor fabricators today, and they're all over the world. Some here in the United States and places like
but tailored for cell cultivated meat or for pharmaceuticals?
That's exactly the point. So that's for pharma.
Right.
And so what we were worried about is like, sure, we can go order, we can go chat with these folks who are used to providing these bioreactors to Pfizer and these other companies. They can charge whatever they want for their protein, right? Yeah. But we can't. We're a, commodity food company. And so we wanted to blow up all the dogma that has kind of gone along with cell culture technology for pharma purposes and figure out like what we actually need. And that was part of the reason why we went through that exercise. At this point, we've actually ordered another a very large set of bioreactors, actually last year, that we're still waiting on. Thank you, supply chain snarls, for gigantic, colossal delays. But we're in the great position of going to these large fabricators and saying like, here's our design that has worked well for us in the past, and here are all the things that you've kind of had included as standard in your biopharma business that we can just do away with. And that has driven down cost and actually shortened lead times, which is nice. So to your point, like, do we need a bunch of startups making bioreactors? We might, right? So I was just doing some back of the envelope math the other day. And if we were to do just 10% of only seafood production today, we would need more bioreactors than were ever made in history.
Yeah.
So yes,
I almost wonder if it's going to be a company making cell cultivated meat. If we use the analogy of Amazon, they're building cloud services. Eventually they did their AWS. Maybe a company like you guys or someone said, hey, we actually built a pretty good one. Why don't we just make a business out of that? At some point that will probably happen.
Yeah. So there are a few inputs that are worth talking about, right, for our industry. One is just the steel bioreactors that everybody needs to grow their, and by the way, it's not super different from a beer fermentation tank. It's a little bit more complicated. Like, we need to monitor pH and temperature and like how much oxygen is dissolved in our nutrients. But by and large, it's essentially a, fermentation tank. So like that whole beer brewing industry actually has a lot of overlay with our field. But that business is so different from ours, right? That's like going to steel mills and like, ASME engineers and like fabricators, and that's its own thing. Then there's the cell culture nutrients, right? The stuff that we feed ourselves, which are, sounds fancy, but it's really just kind of, a slightly more expensive version of Gatorade, amino acids, salts and sugars, and a couple little things here and there to help the cells feel like they're at home in the body. And that's its own totally separate supply chain, right? So sourcing the kinds of volumes that we're going to need, at the right level of quality, right? We actually don't need pharma grade. Why would I ever need pharma grade sodium chloride when I can just use salt, as long as the, quality parameters are relatively narrow. So, I think there's some really exciting things going on right now with, companies like Merck and Lonza and others who are starting to think about, like, we might be selling way more cell culture media than we've ever sold before to not pharma folks, because of the volumes that we're talking about doing. And they are probably best positioned to like manage that incredibly complex supply chain rather than a company like us doing it. So I would be really surprised if this turns into like a Rockefeller, like vertically integrated industry. I think at least for Wildtype, our core competency is everything from the sort of establishment of cell lines to the rollout of the finished product, and then, branding and marketing and food safety and all that good stuff. Yeah. All the stuff upstream of that probably just doesn't make sense for us to do. And by the way, it's also an interesting idea. Like, should somebody be making cell lines for the whole industry and just specialize in that?
I think you're going to see a lot of horizontal businesses. Like you said, I don't think we need complete vertical integration. So I think as the industry matures, we'll probably see more of that. I do want to talk about your salmon and kind of assembling that and where we are. So salmon's a beautiful fish, a beautiful food. Like it's kind of complex when I look at it. It's this mix of like fat and layers, etc. And so in your prototypes and kind of early prototypes and where you are now, how close are we to kind of building? If I were to go out to Seattle on the water, pick up a salmon on my fishing pole, how close are we to that?
We've actually done some blind taste tests of our salmon sushi with conventional salmon. And, we try to give ourselves the biggest handicap possible. Like we'll benchmark against Ora King. If you've ever had that, it's a farmed, king salmon from New Zealand. It's one of the best farmed, products you can get. So we'll benchmark against that. And, most people can't tell the difference, between our product and that, which is great. That's a great place to be. But if you ask somebody who spent, like one of our investors, for example, spent his whole life in the seafood industry and actually salmon here in Seattle, if you ask him, he'll be like, okay, here's 15 things that need to change, right? But like that, he does not represent the vast majority of Americans. What I can say is I actually, sometimes when we're doing a tasting and I don't have time to make sushi rice, I'll like pop into Whole Foods or someplace like that and like pick up a bento box of sushi or nigiri and, kind of use their rice in their prep and just kind of swap out our salmon for their stuff. And I think it's safe to say that like for that level of quality, we're consistently way better. I think people will be very happy with that. If you go into like the finest omakase restaurant with a chef who knows exactly which part to get from the salmon, and like create it in like the perfect way, we'll be a little lacking. So I'd say that's sort of where we are on the scale. So is there room for improvement? Like, absolutely. But do we have the best alternative seafood product in the world right now? I think we do. I think we might.
Well, can you talk about like putting it together, right? So, when I eat a piece of salmon, there are those layers and there's fat in there. So when you assemble it, what do you cell cultivating? Are you kind of using any sort of hybrids, like maybe using like a plant-based fat? Mm-hmm. Are you doing what I'm eating? Is it all cell cultured animal? Yeah.
So we use a plant-based scaffold. Okay. There's probably as many ways to make cell cultivated products as there are companies these days. Yeah. But I can speak for Wildtype. So we have found that the best way to get the cells to do what we need, and essentially oversimplifying, if you find cells that are in kind of a stem cell like state, right? There are kind of two levels. There's like the pluripotent stem cell that can become anything, right? It's like a young child that's just been born and has its whole future ahead of it, and it can kind of choose whichever career set you want. And then one step down from that, there's still cells that have great potential to kind of turn into many different types, but they're a little bit more limited, and they still have this long lifespan. Like you can get them to replicate for years and years and years before they run out of rejuvenation, essentially. And the type of cell that we work with can become just the things that are part of meat. So fat, specifically muscle, connective tissue, the kind of fibrous bits that you kind of bite into. But it couldn't become like a neuron, for example, right? And that's okay because we're not worried about that. So those are the kinds of cells that we cultivate, and the environment that they live on really helps direct the cells to their ultimate fate. So if you give them a really stiff kind of environment, they'll want to become more like a bone, for example. If you give them a really soft kind of fat-rich environment, they'll kind of start taking up those fats and become like a fat cell. And so that's how we've cultivated our, that's the type of cells that we've selected. And the reason we use the scaffolds we do is because the scaffold itself has multiple textural properties. So the white part of the scaffold has a set of properties that are more conducive to fat. And it turns out actually the white part isn't all fat. It also is this sort of place where kind of muscles come together in the fish. Which is why you kind of see this bending effect if you look really closely at a beautiful piece of salmon nigiri. And then for the red part of the flesh, the more muscular part, we have a sort of a different texture. And so, this, as you might appreciate, is something that we've been working on for a bunch of years to, really get the right finished properties. But, in the end, our product is both real salmon cells and this plant-based scaffold. It's not like we can remove it. And so that's something that, I think we've spend a little bit of time chatting with, focus groups and other things like that, just understanding how best to kind of talk about these products, what vocabulary to use, right? Because this isn't just salmon, right? Because there are, there are this sort of like plant-based backbone as well. And so learning how to talk about that in an effective way with our future customers has been a big learning journey for us.
Let's talk about like when this comes to market. I think in your announcement, you're starting to look towards working with culinary innovators. I think you talked about working with higher end restaurants, and all with an eye towards looking towards rollout. So let's talk about that. Where are we in terms of like starting to see this, where I can maybe fly down to California, maybe go out to a restaurant in Seattle and actually get some Wildtype salmon?
So in the early days, we will be a very supply constrained business. As I mentioned, we've got a couple of facilities that are in motion that we're building, and they'll come online at different times, and their production capacity will step up. But I got to tell you, it's just a really tough time to be creating a company that builds real things, just because ordering everything is taking 4 or 5 times as long as it used to, just even a year and a half ago. But that's old news at this point. But we're definitely feeling the bite of that. But as a result, because we'll have such small quantities in the early days. And again, like even like 20 or 30 or 40, 50,000 pounds a year, like that might sound like a lot. But as I said, like seafood is 350 billion pounds a year. I mean, it's just like a staggering amount of volume. And, even to do, be on the menu in, 5 or 6 restaurants is really just a drop in the bucket. And I think that's what we're talking about for the first year or so while more production comes online. But, even us, I talk to other founders in our space about this all the time. Even if we're super successful, we build like 100 facilities, like it's still like a relatively small piece of the overall pie, right? Which is why it is so exciting to see other companies kind of coming online and also offering products. And I think in the seafood space, that's particularly interesting because there are so many types of sea creatures that are part of the menus, right? I mean, you've got mollusks and you've got, octopus and you've got uni and you've got all the finfish and you've got shellfish and crustaceans, and they all are so different. They all have different sort of textural properties and different culinary applications. And, but yeah, for us in the early days, while we're supply constrained, we'll be in, kind of just a handful of restaurants. And, we're focused on sushi. So that's kind of how you'll find us.
I thought the acquisition of Culture Decadence by Upside was interesting. I don't know if that foretold to me an era where we're going to start to see think of like a General Motors for like cultivated food, right? Where they just have a bunch of different brands or lines. Maybe it comes through acquisition or maybe another good analogy is like the Facebook, who bought Instagram, et cetera. So, I mean, you don't have to necessarily speak to you guys because I'm sure you want to become like a giant seafood company, but where do you see this industry going? Do you see more of that type of acquisition activity? Because as we're talking about things like production capacity, it is a very capital intensive business, right? Like you're raising $100 million, you're going to expand your manufacturing, but like it's very expensive. It's hard to source the materials. It seems like at some point it makes sense to have, where scale matters and bigger companies can scale faster. And maybe they just start doing roll-ups of kind of smaller, interesting lines of food out there.
So it's this complex 3-dimensional thing that you're talking about, which is, there are these new upstart companies like us and Upside and others, that are building, alternative seafood companies. There are lots of plant-based brands coming up. There's, fungi, mycoprotein. Like I am in the industry and I even have a hard time keeping up with all the new entrants these days. So on one hand, you've got this, grassroots movement of companies coming down the channel. And then on the other end, you've got the big players like Thai Union recently, which is, one of the biggest seafood suppliers in the world based in Thailand, of course, announcing that they're putting in, I forgot the exact number, but it was tens of millions of dollars into a plant-based seafood, division, right? So they're actually going to start innovating and making their own plant-based products. And I suspect that's being driven both by consumer demand. So, by the way, the partnerships that we announced earlier this year, including with Pokeworks, those folks came to us actually, because, their customers are saying like, hey, we really want a sustainable option. And, we're not happy with the options that are on the table. And by the way, it would be nice if our seafood was also not polluted and didn't have things like parasites and you have to kind of freeze kill and, microplastics and antibiotics and all that stuff. And so to answer your question, I don't know where this is all going to go other than to say that both the really big established players as well as upstart companies are all kind of putting new products into the mix. At the end of the day, I think it'll end up being relatively simple, which is, the companies that make the best tasting products that are as close to nutritionally equivalent. And in seafood, that really matters, right? Because I think people elect salmon, for example, because it's a relatively low saturated fat product. It's high in omega-3s and, relatively lean, healthy protein. I think the company that achieves those things will win. And I don't think all companies will be successful at that. And, just kind of look around at some of the pictures from some companies and, it's definitely a work in progress. I think the easy low hanging fruit are things like fish sticks and sort of minced fish and, things that aren't whole cut or highly structured. I think the more challenging element is, making whole fish fillet or making a saku block, which is what we do, for a sushi purpose. I think that's where things will be a little bit more, narrow and limited.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure why we haven't seen more companies like Just doing both, right? Like, because there is like this scalability in plant-based that is like something that's more accessible now versus the cell culture stuff is very kind of dependent on like the technology evolution and et cetera. So who knows? And maybe we'll start to see acquisitions of companies doing cell culture meat by traditional meat companies. Like I could see that happening, like a Tyson or someone eventually moving into the space. But I think it's going to be an interesting market to watch.
That's an interesting point because, if you think about strategic capabilities, the underlying technology for companies like ours are things, disciplines like cell biology, biomedical engineering, things like that. That's not part of the wheelhouse of traditional food companies at all. However, it is part of the core competency set of pharmaceutical companies, interestingly. So, if you think about companies that are best suited to actually replicate what we're doing, it's actually not food companies at all. So does that then make our industry a lot more interesting from an acquisition perspective to conventional food companies? Yeah, it might.
Or maybe one of those companies kind of in the in-between space, like a AB InBev or something, right? Because they've already started to go down kind of the bio brewing subsidiary path, right?
Yeah, that's right. We'll there are a lot of similarities between brewing and what we're doing up to the point of cell harvest. After that, it gets a little broader and a little bit more challenging. But yeah.
Well, the big question I have for you, Justin, is when am I going to be able to try some of the Wildtype food up here in Seattle? When are we going to see that at like the high-end restaurants here?
Hopefully not too long. We've had a really great multiple year dialogue going with FDA. And they've come a really long way in terms of how they're thinking about this industry since we started talking to them back in when was that? Late 2019.
Wouldn't you say cell cultivated fish road to market is going a little faster than beef and chicken?
It's less. There are a few parties, I would say. So for anybody working on beef or pork or chicken, USDA needs to be involved because that's the agency that oversees those products today. And so with seafood
or catfish,
that's right. Yeah.
Catfish is the funny outlier.
You know that. Yeah. There's a whole interesting story about politics behind that we don't need to get into today, but you're right. But yeah, for all other types of seafood, it's really just FDA. And so, our job is a little bit easier. And honestly, I have nothing but good things to say about how that consultation process has gone. And we all have the same objective, right? FDA, I think rightly so, prides itself on having one of the most, if not the most secure and safe food systems in the world. And that's what we want too, right? We want to make sure that we're being really thoughtful that, traditional things like listeria don't show up in our production process. And, having this consultation process with FDA has been great as we've been working with our own food safety experts, as well as theirs. I think we've come up with a really nice way to apply existing safety frameworks to this new technology.
But there's been no outward announcement from the FDA or one of the companies in the space saying by X month of X year, you can serve this at restaurants. Nothing like that
Not yet. And I think part of it's because it's entirely bespoke, right? I think if you were to kind of get under a non-disclosure agreement and look at each company, I think all of our technologies are, pretty significantly different from one to the next, I would guess. And so I think FDA has to kind of look at them individually.
But you are, I imagine, you're talking to Lou Cooper House over at Blue Nalu and I mean, because it's such a small industry and you guys are probably all working with the FDA. It behooves you all to work together to a certain degree, I would imagine. Yeah.
It's been less blanket, more kind of custom specific than I was expecting as a process. And I think part of it is because, FDA, for whatever reason, didn't decide to just roll out and say like, hey, they might eventually, but they haven't yet. Here's the 19 steps you need to take to kind of bring a, cell cultivated product through this pre-market consultation process and begin selling in the United States. It's been this period of joint discovery, right? Because us and Upside and others kind of came to them very early and said like, hey, we're starting to think about eventually commercializing these products. This was years ago. Here's our technology today. Here's kind of the things that we're thinking about changing and improving. What do you think? And they're like, oh, interesting. Like, tell us more, help us understand what are all the inputs, like what concentrations, what's in the finished product. And I think it's just really been this kind of coming together. But you're right. I just had a really great dinner with another founder in our space last week, and this was a big topic of conversation.
While we're talking about U.S. regulatory, the U.S. seems to be somewhat of a laggard just generally when you start looking at how fast Singapore is moving, how fast Israel's moving towards just really kind of putting the pedal to the metal on creating frameworks and funding, et cetera, for future food. Are you getting the sense that the U.S. is kind of waking up to the fact that this is like a matter of like national security? It's a matter of kind of our ultimate sustainability. I mean, do you see like an awakening?
I think my friend Matt Spence maybe published something with you all, didn't he?
He spoke at CS and he talked about that too.
Yeah. I think he articulates this really well. Singapore and the US are coming from really different places. And I think it's an interesting case study, right? So you've got the island nation of Singapore that imports, I don't know what percentage, but if I were to guess, I'm guessing it's 98+% of its food, right? Like that is a real clear threat. Like if, their enemies somehow cut off their supply chains, it's hard to imagine Singapore ever being in war with anybody, but in the event that happened, that's a real vulnerability, right? And so there's a clear national imperative to insulate the country against that. And I think that's permeated the pace at which they've been moving with regulatory, I think very active role they've actually played in making investments in, kind of companies from that country. The U.S. is just different, right? We certainly, for seafood, we actually import the vast majority of the seafood that's eaten in this country, but seafood is not the biggest source of animal protein for us, right? As it is in Asia. Here it's, beef and chicken and pork. And we make most of those products, domestically. And so I think there's just less of a burning need. And Israel, by the way, I would put in the same camp as Singapore, in terms of, I think they grow a lot more of their food than Singapore does, but, still reliant on imports largely, certainly for things like seafood. I think it's just a different thing. But if you take the longer view, it's hard, for us as Americans who are like constantly focused on like the next 2 years to like think about what happens 50 years from now. But what does happen 50 years from now when like we haven't upgraded our food production technology and the rest of the world has? Like that, does that put us at a significant disadvantage against the rest of the world? Yeah.
If you think about it from an industry standpoint, like the U.S. in some ways is leading in terms of future food. You look at Northern California and all the future food startups for you guys. But with China's recent kind of moves and making this a strategic initiative, like building the industry, the future perspective, it feels like the U.S. should be paying more attention.
I just had this conversation with a good friend of mine, and there's this laissez-faire free market approach that is so core to our identity in this country, right? And if the main job of government is to not get in the way of, productive businesses and doing their things, like there's something to be said about that, right? And I still, I know a lot of people are bearish on the United States. I'm very bullish on this country, and I always will be. There is a reason why there's so much innovation here, right? And are there things that our government can do to get out of its own way when it comes to innovation? Sure. Absolutely. But like, let's give ourselves some credit, right? The electric car revolution started here, right? The world's next, world-class automotive company that kicked off the entire electric vehicle transformation began in the United States. Same thing with cell phones largely, and all the, at least the current version of them. And we are still innovating. And so to a certain extent, I kind of see the other side of the coin. Would I like it if like the U.S. government was like, hey, Wildtype, do you want like $100 million, like low interest loan? Yeah, I would. But like, we're also doing okay, as we are today. So it's kind of an interesting and complex question you're raising.
Nice counterpoint. I think it makes a lot of sense. So we've been talking for quite a while, and I know you're trying to build a company with all your fresh funding. So I want to thank you, Justin, for spending time and diving deep into what you guys are doing.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mike. It's always great chatting with you, and thanks for the interest in the company.
I want to thank Justin for spending time with me. I learned a lot from this conversation, including hearing about their conversations with the FDA and where they are in terms of their production process and the possibility of bringing a plant up here to the Pacific Northwest where we are pretty proud of our salmon. So that'll be interesting. Looking forward to possibly tasting salmon up here as well. So If you want to learn more about Wildtype, you can find more about them at wildtypefoods.com. If you want to listen to more podcasts, just go to the usual spaces. You can obviously find it at The Spoon as well. I write about my conversation with Justin and include some links to the funding news, so you can find that at The Spoon. So, all right, folks, that's it for now. We'll have another podcast in just a few days.